One of the major ways that Hitler was far more of a totalitarian leader than Mussolini, who we already discussed, is because of the sheer persecution that he exerts over predominantly the Jewish population, but also Slavs, homosexuals, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, people with physical disabilities, mental disabilities. Ultimately, what Hitler tries to do is, really promote only one type of true German, right? Which, again, is a way that he can try to influence all elements of his population, their public, their private life, again, which is kind of quintessential totalitarianism, which was not something that Mussolini ever was able to completely do. So by 1934, you're going to see that already most Jewish lawyers, doctors, professors, civil servants, musicians had all lost their jobs and the right to practice their professions. So they were already essentially second-class citizens. But this was solidified in 1935 with the passage of the Nuremberg Laws. What the Nuremberg Laws did was they effectively deprived Jews of all of their rights of citizenship. So to expand upon that, the people who were subject to the Nuremberg Laws were anyone who had at least one Jewish grandparent. They would be subject to the law. So you didn't have to be 100% Jewish, so to speak, in order to be deprived of your rights under the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws prevented any marriage or sex between Jews and other Germans. It also said that Jews could not hire German women under the age of 45 as domestic workers. Ultimately, this would be something that would effectively place German women in an inferior position to Jews. So one of the reasons why the Nuremberg Laws forbade that. Jews also could not display the Reich or national flag. Again, the idea, according to Hitler, was that the Jewish population was not truly German, right? So this is a way that they can stop this. And Hitler also declared the boycotting of all Jewish businesses. In addition to the Nuremberg laws, there were other laws that were passed that prevented Jewish people from accessing hospitals, prevented them from being educated past the age of 14, prevented them from using certain public spaces like parks, libraries, and beaches. Any war memorial that had a Jewish name on it would be removed. Now, by 1939, you already saw about 50% of Germany's Jewish population. There were about 500,000 Jews that lived in Germany in 1939, but about 50% of them emigrated. Many of them were the wealthier Jews, the more educated. One of the most prominent examples, of course, were the major contributors to science in the interwar period. Like Einstein would be one of the most prominent examples of a Jewish German who basically felt forced to emigrate from the country. Now, if you left Germany, you actually had to pay a significant fee to the government, an emigration fee, and the government actually used this money to try to finance its economic recovery. Also, the Jewish immigrants actually had to they ended up getting a lot of their property confiscated by the government, so this was also a way that the government could try to finance economic recovery. So in addition to the laws themselves, a significant event that kind of further scapegoated, further targeted the Jewish population was Kristallnacht, which means the Night of the Broken Glass. And this is in 1938. Now, this was an organized attack on Jewish communities. What happened as a sort of a pretext to this event was that a German diplomat in Paris was assassinated by a young Jewish boy. And ultimately, this was used as a reason to justify destroying a massive number of Jewish communities throughout Germany. This was a week-long campaign of terror against Jews living in Germany. It was very organized. This violence destroyed people's homes, synagogues, businesses. You see here a group of people walking through a town, seeing a Jewish business with the windows smashed in. This is a synagogue that is engulfed in flames. And one of the really tragic things about the Kristallnacht was that even though this was organized by the Nazi government against the Jews actually were blamed for the damage. All right, so after Kristallnacht, thousands of Jews were actually arrested, and then they were forced to pay for the damage that was caused during Kristallnacht. So, sort of a hypocritical event, but it shows you how the Jewish population that still remained in Germany, that had not yet emigrated, was further subjugated and ultimately scapegoated. Whoops. Okay, and of course, and we'll get to this a little bit more, the so-called final solution that was instituted afterwards for anyone who had not yet left Germany. Hitler started to devise the most evil plan, something that we still kind of have difficulty fully wrapping our heads around, the orchestrated murder of 6 million European Jews during World War I. This obviously extended far beyond Germany's borders. European Jews from far outside of Germany were also sent to these concentration camps. Basically, it was Hitler's final plan to exterminate the Jewish population. And one of the reasons why this was something that he turned to was because ultimately the Jewish population really had nowhere to turn. People who found themselves to be refugees, found themselves to be forced to flee their homes, really weren't able to find any asylum in other countries. The United States was not a place where the Jewish population was able to successfully emigrate to, and so a lot of them stayed put because they felt like they had no greater option. And so when emigration sort of slowed down, Hitler's solution, therefore, was to just kill them, right? So this resulted in the death of 6 million Jews, but then 6 million other people, including Slavs, Gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, homosexuals, people who were physically and mentally handicapped, and political opponents to the Nazi government. So in total, you see in the Holocaust about 12 million victims to Hitler's totalitarian regime. What we cannot forget, though, is that despite Hitler's sort of ethnic purging of Europe's non-Aryan population, Hitler's government was able to secure a good amount of economic recovery within Germany. And it's one of the major reasons why Hitler was so popular, and also you could argue would be a reason why some people in the German population were able to effectively ignore some of the much more controversial things that Hitler did. So Hitler promised work and bread to all of his citizens, and effectively he delivered on these promises with his significant public works programs. So under Hitler's economic plan, significant projects, including the building of superhighways like the Autobahn, office buildings, huge sports stadiums, including the 1936 Olympic Sports Stadium, and you can see this is a sort of an Olympic presentation going into the 1936 Berlin Olympics, public housing projects. Ultimately, all these things not only were able to further industrialize Germany, but they were able to provide significant jobs, not too far off from some of the public works programs we saw occur in FDR's New Deal in the United States. I just mentioned earlier the 1936 Berlin Olympics, but it's also important to realize that because the Olympics were held in Berlin in 1936, this serves to try to ultimately legitimize Germany, showing its emergence as, again, an economically viable country, a strong country. And this was before the outside population was, again, really fully aware of Hitler's social plans that were so devastating and racist. So actually, Germany generated a good deal of respect with its impressive show in the 1936 Olympics. But also in 1936, Germany is starting to rearm itself, right? Its rearmament plans, again, working on developing military infrastructure, right, and spending more money on military development in general, was one of the major reasons why Germany's economy was able to recover. Just like we see in so many other countries that struggled from the Great Depression, really it was the rearmament process that completely got them out of the Depression. It provided many jobs. That's mainly the reason why it was so successful. But the important thing to realize about the rearmament process was it was obviously a violation of the Treaty of Versailles. So other things about the economic recovery, the results of it, you're going to see a massive drop in unemployment. There were about 6 million unemployed in January of 1933, but about 3 years later, you only have 1 million people unemployed, so huge drop there. By 1938, you actually had a shortage of workers. So this gives us a sense that, you know, everyone can ultimately find a job because there was so much of a demand for people to actually work. You actually found that women started to take on jobs because of this shortage of workers. And this is a little bit of a deviation from the previous approach towards women in Nazi Germany as well as Italy, where women were meant to stay at home and basically produce babies for the regime. You actually saw that, at least temporarily, women were able to take on jobs and leave that traditional position in the home. You also saw that there was a moderate increase in the standard of living for the average employed worker by 1938. And you saw businesses rapidly increase their profits. And I mean, ultimately, what's significant to realize is that, at least in an economic sense, Hitler really did deliver on his promises. You can see in this chart here, and sorry, it's a little cut off, but this is 1932, 1933, 34, and so on. You see how rapidly the unemployment numbers drop in Germany under Hitler. One limit, though, to Hitler's regime, I guess you could say, is whether there was a complete social revolution, right? What you're going to see still is, although there was an increase in standard of living for even the working classes, predominantly it was the well-educated classes, the wealthier classes going into the Third Reich that still were on top, ultimately, even after Hitler rose to power. So the well-educated classes kind of still held on to most of the advantages that they already had. Even though you had a rise in the standard of living, it was really only a modest one, modest social leveling. So again, the working class wasn't incredibly better off when compared to the middle and upper classes. And even though I said that there was a period where women started to work around 1938 or so in Germany, women traditionally in Nazi Germany as well as fascist Italy, you saw, were viewed really as housewives and mothers, right? Hitler implored women to make babies for the Reich. I mentioned previously that women's involvement in the Hitler Youth was basically to make them good mothers, right? Actually, even pregnancy out of wedlock was not something that was frowned upon during this period in Germany, because every baby was seen as a contribution to the Reich. Having a high population was one strategy to kind of increase the overall international prestige of the country. You actually saw, just like in fascist Italy, there were laws and incentives for people to get married and have children. After the Enabling Act, there was a law for the encouragement of marriage passed, which actually gave newly married couples easy loans. So, you know, basically giving them further incentive to have more children. You had birth control and abortion were actually forbidden for German women, but interestingly, they were still allowed for the so-called inferior ethnic groups like Slavs, Jews, and Gypsies, right? Because, you know, clearly the Third Reich did not want these members of the population to be having children. For the most part, again, with the exception of that 1938 and on period where there was a shortage of workers, women tended to be denied meaningful occupations outside the home. And again, it was only really in wartime that women started to actually work in offices and factories. So the major difference, what we should really take away from the discussion about Hitler is how this contrasts with Mussolini, right? We need to understand that this was much more totalitarian in nature, right? That the population was much more effectively controlled, that you actually saw that you saw a much more successful economic policy. This is significant. Remember, the corporate state in fascist Italy did not work particularly well, whereas you saw a much more significant economic recovery. Also, just thinking about these social policies against the Jewish population, right? Thinking about the Nuremberg laws and thinking about Hitler's final solution, right? Hitler more effectively used terror to try to suppress the opposition. So what I would keep in mind, something that might be asked on an essay, would be, you know, ultimately comparing the extent to which these different leaders established totalitarian government. And I'd say that really it's Hitler and Stalin who are much more totalitarian than Mussolini, but you should be able to prove why with examples. So we will now move on to World War II.